Welcome to ReImagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic freedom. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. Years ago, I put together an edited volume called Arguments for Liberty. Every chapter took a different school of moral philosophy and made the case for liberalism within it. The point wasn't to just be an introduction to moral philosophy by way of being an introduction to liberalism, but also to show that the case for liberty isn't limited to a single philosophical school. It's much more universal than that. But it's not limited to academic philosophy either. Religion informs the ethical worldview of most people, and discussing the case for liberalism within religious contexts enriches liberalism and our understanding of it. That's why I'm so happy to be joined today by my friend Kat Murti. Kat is the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy and co-founder of Feminists for Liberty, but she is also a practicing Hindu. Hinduism is a fascinating faith I know too little about. So I asked Kat to join me on the show to give an introduction to Hinduism and then to discuss how her Hindu faith informs her radical liberalism and how her liberalism informs her Hindu practice. Let me very briefly mention that ReImagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you enjoy these discussions and want to get early access to new episodes, you can become a supporter by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Kat Murti. For listeners who are unfamiliar with Hinduism, which I imagine is a lot of people listening right now, and I know this is a big question, but what is Hinduism? Can you give us the basics?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and it's difficult to answer, right? The basic is that Hinduism is the world's oldest continuously practiced religion or faith. Hinduism's been around for at least 5,000 years. There's evidence of early Hindu practices, potentially as far back as 12,000 BC. That's like the beginnings of human civilization. But of course, what I, as a Hindu in 2023, might see as my faith would probably be extremely different from what somebody, in 10,000 BC or 5,000 BC or even 1,000 years ago might have viewed as what it meant to be Hindu. And they probably wouldn't have called themselves that either, right? There's a reason why a lot of Hindus will say that it's not a religion, it's a way of life. It's sort of like a mindset, it's a background. We don't proselytize, we're not a proselytizing religion. It's most Hindus were born into Hinduism. We didn't have any sort of official way of converting into Hinduism until very recently in the last century, mostly came about with interest from hippies who wanted to be Hindus, and so we came up with a way to do it, right? But I think one of the core concepts of Hinduism is that there is one truth, but there are many different ways of seeing it, and that kind of makes Hinduism very tolerant, potentially more tolerant than any other faith that you hear about, because you can be a Hindu and you can be an atheist, you can be a Hindu and you can be a very fervent believer, you can be a Hindu and you can be an agnostic, and there's nothing in Hinduism that says you must have one specific set of beliefs. You don't need to belong to a specific congregation. We don't have a leader who tells us what our rules are or what we should believe. Now, that doesn't mean that the average Hindu doesn't have a whole lot of constraints that they might put on themselves. As a result of their Hindu beliefs. A lot of these are vary greatly by their specific community and the specific area that they are from. And it is tied to their Hinduism, but they're all just different facets of Hinduism. For me as a Hindu, I can go to a church, I can go to a synagogue, I can go to any of these different ways and experience God in that way if I want to, and that makes me no less a Hindu, which is difficult to understand for people of other faiths, I think, where that's kind of like a declaration of a difference in faith. I had this conversation with Emily Eakins a long time ago, several years ago, and she was putting out a study that she did, a survey on faith in America. And one of the things I was asking her is how, why there wasn't more about Hinduism in it, just as a personal interest. but also how she was defining practicing Hindus, right? Because what makes a practicing Hindu? I have an altar in my home that I spend time with, etc. Many Hindus do, many Hindus don't. I have friends and family who might go to a temple every day or every week, and I have others who haven't been in years. I have Hindu friends who do consider themselves very observant and others who don't. And this makes it very difficult to define. In Emily Eakin's case, what we came to is one of the difficulties with survey data around this is that, well, what makes one a practicing adherent of a religion oftentimes comes down to, well, do you have a congregation? Do you go with the congregation? And do you follow a set of practices on a regular basis alongside this congregation? And that's just not how Hinduism works. If that is what you want out of Hinduism, you can get it. But it's a very personal faith, a very personal approach to the world that I think probably shapes the way that most Hindus think about others and about themselves and about the world that we live in, but in a very subtle way. It's difficult as well to extricate ideas about Hinduism from ideas about India. India is, of course, not the only Hindu nation. There's many other nations with many Hindus in it, both historically and especially now with the vast Indian diaspora. But most Indians are Hindu, not all. Most Indians are Hindu. And so a lot of our beliefs kind of come from that as well. They're these more cultural beliefs, cultural compacts. And so you see that as well. It's definitely almost as if like a lot of Jews might say that they're Jewish. They identify as culturally Jewish, but not religiously Jewish. That's also a part of the faith. And so it's difficult. There's just thousands of years of being Hindu, and what that means something, I think, uniquely different to every single Hindu, both in practice and in conception.
Just as a brief aside, the point about the problems of survey data and measuring is I think an interesting one, and probably one that a lot of listeners haven't really thought about or aware of, because it is the case that when political scientists are out there measuring religiosity and whatnot, they do it through a remarkably Western monotheism perspective, where the practice of religion is commitment to this faith community that then manifests as one day a week attending some sort of church, synagogue, temple sort of thing. And I was at a conference once talking with some political scientists. And so I was at the table, and then there was a woman who works doing legal aid in the Sikh community in, I think it was Los Angeles. And the two of us were basically telling these political scientists, like, look, in my case, like, most Buddhists don't attend a temple regularly. It's not part of the practice. If that's what you're measuring, you're not going to pick it up. And she was saying the same is true for Sikh community. And it was a political scientist like, whoa,
That's the exact same thing with Hindus. There are Hindus who do. There are Hindus for whom it is such a huge part of their community, their practice. But most Hindus probably mostly observe their faith in private at home or amongst their family members, and in some cases they may not outwardly express their faith at all. It might just be kind of what's shaping whom they are as a person, just from that background. It's cultural in a way, and so that's kind of what I was thinking about when I was talking about India, because when one of the things when I've had friends who visit India for the first time, I always like to talk to them about their experiences and kind of how that went and stuff like that. And there are two main things that come out of every single discussion I've had with folks about, like, okay, you went to India. What was it like? These two things always come up. And one is there are so many people, because people are just blown away by the fact that there are just everywhere you go, there are people. You can be the most rural area and there are people, right? So that's surprising to people. And then the other one that I found really surprises people is how much religion is just a part of life. And it's not in this sort of, I mean, of course, there are very like fanatical Hindus and people who follow fanatical faith beliefs everywhere. And I think that's a growing movement for political reasons now in India. But for most Hindus, it's just a part of our daily life. Like it might just be things like the happy birthday song, as it's sung in India, includes a verse about "May God bless you," right? It's just these little things. The way that everyone expects that on your first day of a new job, you're not going to show up on time. You'll be about a half an hour late past the 10 a.m. hour. Well, they haven't written that into their handbooks. It's not a specific religious belief, but it does come from these kind of cultural conceptions around the religion and things like that. And so, we have all of these little things that are just kind of like daily life for people.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of times, though, a relationship to God. And so let me use that to ask about, are there core, I guess, metaphysical commitments to Hinduism at its center? Because like there's lots of, it's a large tradition with lots of variants spread geographically across diverse populations and so on and so forth. So there's going to be variants, but is there a core set of metaphysical, beliefs about a particular sort of divine being or beings, a particular, structure or origins of the universe, like the kinds of things that we would think of as, the core religious commitments of, if we're talking about Christianity or Islam or something else, there's this stuff that makes it.
Yes and no. So, I mean, as a non-Christian, my understanding is what makes you a Christian is belief in John 3:16. I believe it's that there is one God who had one son whose name is Jesus, who died for our sins or something similar to that, right? There's no similar belief in Hinduism. There's not, like I said earlier, you don't have to be a theist even. You can be an atheist, you can be agnostic and still be a Hindu, and that's not even a modern conception as far back as the Vedas, which are kind of like the closest you get to having books in our faith. There's 4 Vedas, and they're sort of the central of the faith, but we're not a book-based religion. Most Hindus haven't read the Vedas, especially not in that sense. They probably have parts of them memorized, but they haven't read or conceived of them in that way. It's not the same way as in the Bible. We don't have like a set of we don't have like the 10 commandments or things like that you'd have to follow in that same way. There is, for example, concept of Manusmriti, which is like a book of rules, almost similar to maybe Leviticus, for example. And in the very same way, it's sort of become this very politicized topic that a lot of political Hindus now bring up a lot, and they have these kind of conceptions around it. But most Hindus, for at least in the modern era, friends, family of the last few generations, they never even really thought about or spent much time thinking about what happens in Manusmriti, because it's just so much like not a part of their daily life or their conception of the religion, right? And, there's monotheistic views of Hinduism. There's polytheistic. There's all sorts of different things. Now, I will say there is probably the most Hindus probably have a version that falls something along the lines of there is a God or a divine being that is in and of everything. It's all of us are of God. We are made by God. We are God within ourselves. Everything in the universe is of and by God. There's different ways to conceive this, but mostly split into the triumvirate of Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the like sort of rule maker, or the one who's kind of keeping things running in stasis, and then Shiva, who's the destroyer, right? And so you have all 3 of these, and then there's a whole mythology outside of this of their partners and things like that. We have an idea within Hinduism of both male and female energy and their equal importance. in all things. You must have a balance between them, and they have different roles. And so there are certainly beliefs like that that are shared. There's there's infinite gods within Hinduism, but most Hindus would recognize a certain set of gods as the ones that they are used to. Those are going to be gods, many of whom a non-Hindu in the modern era would probably at least have seen before, even if their conceptions are quite different than what a practicing Hindu might believe, like Ganesha or like Kali, the goddess of destruction. I kind of view Shiva as more creative destruction and Kali as more just pure destruction, for example. But that's something that Hindus disagree on, for example. So there are some core beliefs, but they don't actually require you to believe them in exactly that way.
I'm going to ask about the ethics now. And so one thing, Hinduism has the notion of ahimsa, or non-harming as a central principle, which is interesting because I just finished writing an essay about Buddhist liberalism and didn't use that term from the Sanskrit, but that same principle shows up. I mean, obviously they're both Indian origin faiths, and
Yeah, this is very off the cuff, but I often like to, when I'm trying to make the analogy for people, I sometimes think of it as Buddhism is like the Protestantism if Hinduism is the Catholicism, right? It's the narrowing down of the faith and releasing some of the ritual from it.
and so I'm just curious about it because I like it's remarkable how both of these just really center a form of like, harmlessness as a fundamental ethical principle.
Yes, I think that that's true. And I think that's one of those things too that I notice there is an outward appreciation of this. Certainly Hindus are more likely to be vegetarian, for example, than most other faiths probably, other than perhaps things like Jainism, which is again an offshoot of Hinduism from quite a while ago. But the most Hindus still are not vegetarians. They probably consume some manner of non-veg at some point, even though many of them probably consume much less than, say, your average Christian. But I do think that the mentality behind it is still quite different. This is something that I've found comes up in all sorts of funny things that you really wouldn't expect. Like, I saw a study a while ago, and I can't quote this because this was several years ago, but I remember it sticking out. I was at actually a political campaign conference, and I saw this just like a study that someone was talking about that they had done, and they've broken down by demographics which groups were most interested in which issues. And Indians, both in India and Indian Americans, rated the environment and climate change as one of the most important issues to them above all else. And of course, like, people might question, okay, well, India is not known for having the best environment in the world. And I think that there's other elements that have to do with that. A lot of it has to do with just wealth. We do know that the wealthier a country is, the better the environment tends to be, the better treatment of animals tends to be. And I think that this is a point that India is certainly reaching towards. But the fact that that issue stuck out so important for so many Indians, again, not all of whom, but many of whom are Hindu, I think really does come from that concept of ahimsa, even if they're not actively thinking about it this way. And it's something that I've found comes up in all sorts of different policy discussions and values discussions where we're not actually talking about our religion, but I notice that Hindus tend to view the environment and animals and things like that as individuals are having their own right to exist, to be there, just the same way as a human does. Whereas I think in the more Christian conception, God created the animals to serve the humans. And I think that that kind of changes the way in which we see the world around us, right? And so I think that there's things like that come up. And it's not that Hindus are just somehow more empathetic, loving people. Some of them certainly might be, but there can be very cruel, horrible people as well who are Hindu. And but I do think that that's just sort of a way that when we talk about Hinduism being a way of life, I think that that's kind of like the way that we view the world, that lens that we're seeing the world through because of our cultural or ethical or religious priors is different.
So one thing that two of us share is we have committed our professional lives to the advancement of political liberty and economic liberty, social liberty, individual liberty in a way that is, say, quite radical. You and I are kind of we're outside of the mainstream in terms of the degree of liberty that we demand in the world. And I think I wish we weren't too. Well, someday.
I wish we weren't.
We're working at it. But for both of us, like the reason we've done this is not because it's an incredibly lucrative career in, the cause of liberty, but because our basic principles, our moral values, our perspective on the world compels us into this. Like this is really important. How does your Hindu beliefs, the values that brings to you, how does that play into the thrust of the thing you've chosen to do with your life and career?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up. This is something that it's like a fun thought experiment that I play with myself all the time. Am I a Hindu because I am a libertarian, or am I a libertarian because I am a Hindu? Right? Because obviously not all Hindus are libertarians by far, unfortunately, right? And certainly not all libertarians are Hindus. But for me, those two are so intertwined. And part of that is because in Hinduism, as I see it, and as many have seen it historically as well, we have this concept of each individual has their own right path that they need to follow, and what is right and wrong for that individual is not the same as what is right and wrong for another individual who is set on another path. Now, I think that there is something that all religions struggle with, which is the politicization and the temptation to give into power structures, right? So I did say that Hinduism itself is non-hierarchical. However, we are the product of the world around us, and so certainly there are things like the caste system, which is illegal in India, and which I think is much better viewed as community differences at this point, because we do have communal or language or food differences that I think still make these conflicts continue to arise. But I think that was politicized into the concept of dharma very much, so that for a lot of people, they view it as solely caste-based. Like, because you were born into this caste, dharma being your path, the right path for you as an individual, right? And so I think for a long time it was viewed as a sort of caste-based thing. But I don't think that that's actually how we should view dharma. I think dharma is much more about the individual person, the individual soul, in as much as you can be besouled or be a soul. And so there is a right path for each person. There is a role for them to play, but it is not the same as anyone else's. And the right and wrong for each person is going to vary greatly based upon what their role is, what their dharma is. And then many people know the concept of karma as well. It's loosely translated kind of off the cuff as good or bad points that you're getting. That ties to your dharma, right? Like, if are you fulfilling that role in the right way or not? And so I might disagree with what you're doing, but it is not my path to walk, and I don't know what is right for you. I only know what is right for me, right? And I think that is a very centrally libertarian view. I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with libertarianism, because you can disagree with someone. You can think that what they're doing is unethical or immoral or just stupid. but that doesn't mean that you use the power of the state to stop them. And that for me is very much like there are many things that people do that I think they shouldn't do, and yet I think they should be legal, and I think that they should have the ability to do them. Um, and so I think that that's actually, for me, that is a very Hindu conception. And there are many different, like, unique issues that I think about, and I play that same thought experiment on, am I viewing this through a Hindu lens? Am I viewing this through a libertarian lens? And oftentimes I find that it's some sort of amalgamation of the two, and it's almost impossible to fully separate them.
When you're talking about this unique path for each person, is that path freely chosen by them in a Hindu conception, in the sense that we could use as a synonym for it something like self-authorship or autonomy? Or is it something that is decided for them, just like not by you and me and the other people they share the world with, but rather some sort of other kind of metaphysical constructs or principles or their place in how this all fits together?
So this is where we get back to the discussion about is there one set view in Hinduism? And I think that this is one of the things that Hindus would probably disagree on, right? Uh, because there are Hindus like me who, more or less believe that you're born to fill a role. There is a role, there is a path, there is something. It's a big picture. It's way too big of a picture for me to ever understand it, but it exists, right? And so that is the path that you're following. You're born into it. And then there are Hindus who probably believe that it is entirely self-written. And there's probably a whole lot of people who are somewhere in between. You might view this something like the Calvinist debate of the 1700s, right? Like, is there predetermination or not? But for the average Hindu, it's just not as much of their daily thought process. Like, when I think about it, my personal view, I'm not speaking for Hinduism, but my own personal interpretation of it is, I think that there is probably some degree of predetermination in the world. Things work in some way. They're meant to work in some way. There is some plan, maybe a plan. Maybe there's many plans that are sort of working against each other. I don't know. I'm not capable of knowing. I'm such a small part of it. And yet, I think that we should act nonetheless as if we have free will and try to make the best decisions for ourselves and the most moral and ethical decisions at all points, regardless of whether or not we're actually able to make that choice or not.
Why is then, if Hinduism and libertarianism for you are so intertwined that you can't, like in your own mind, you can't kind of conceptually tease them apart in terms of what's motivating you and which one, came first and how they fully inform each other and so on. Why isn't India liberal?
Well, power is a powerful drug, isn't it? It's the same thing as I talked about earlier. It's religion is a very useful tool to control people. It always has been. It always will be. That doesn't mean that that's a failure of religion itself. That's just simply a facet of it as it can happen. So that's certainly a part of it. And I think we've been viewing a rise of illiberalism in India that's largely coming from this Hindutva thrust of the past few decades. That is something that I think is actually detrimental, not just to India itself, which I believe India has always found her greatest strength in diversity, in communalism, really having different communities of people who are sort of almost self-governing within their community, but interact with each other, exchange in markets together, etc. And so are very different and yet part of the same larger community. And that's existed for thousands of years. There's a reason why so many communities from around the world escaped to India in the early parts of history, right? Because it was just a safer place to be for them. So but Hinduism itself, where, like I said, I believe that Hinduism is fundamentally an individual religion. We are not book-based. We do not have one set of beliefs. And if anything, if there is a core Hindu belief, it's that there is one truth, but there are many different ways to see it. If the best way for you to pursue your truth is through Islam, or is through Judaism, or is through Christianity or Buddhism or Jainism, Sikhism, is through atheism, whatever it is, it's not for me to determine that for you, right? But I think that there is a strong, there's a role here that both the desire for power has played over time. There's also a lot of historical hurts that people feel, whether it's due to the caste system or due to responses to the caste system or due to land disputes, due to things that have happened as a result of colonialism, or things that have happened in some cases, particularly with India, people who've gone out, lived in other countries as Hindus, been sort of felt very oppressed there, and then come back and wanted to have this more radically fervent fundamentalist view of Hinduism as a result of feeling oppressed by more fundamentalist beliefs elsewhere. So all of those, I think, are at play, certainly. And then there's just this constant reactionaryism that happens, and that's sort of fueled a lot of times by what people are seeing in social media misinformation. It's the same as we've seen with polarization in the United States, maybe not along those same religious lines as much, but amongst racial or political lines. So I think that that's happening as well. And it's very frustrating. This thing about Hindutva, too, is that, one, I don't think that it really represents what it means to be a Hindu, but it's also a very narrow view of being a Hindu and of being an Indian. There's this idea that, all Indians wear one national dress, that we all speak Hindi, that we all must be Hindu, but not just Hindu, but a specific version of Hindu with a specific narrow set of Hindu beliefs that are not embraced by all Hindus and have not been embraced by all Hindus, that we all look a certain way. And if you look at what India is and what India always has been and what India's strength has always been, we are a nation of hundreds of different languages and dialects. We are a nation of at least as many individual faith beliefs, particularly when you look at like the difference between this small community from this area and the neighboring small community from this area, right? We are a nation of ethnically, we are actually quite diverse, which I think gets erased a lot of times in the discussion, both within and outside of India. And so it's dangerous and concerning, but I don't think that that comes necessarily from Hinduism. I think that Hinduism can simply be a tool because faith has always been able to be used as a tool in order to push a specific political narrative. But I will say as well, when we're talking about authoritarianism, India historically was one of the most tolerant nations. Even under, for example, Mughal rule, the Mughals were Muslim rulers of India prior to the colonial times, British colonial times. And some of the main Mughal rulers followed a rule of they would oftentimes marry one Hindu, one Muslim, and one Jain or other belief wife as part of their ruling strategy in order to bring together these faiths and have sort of like an approach there, right? So I think that there's lots of things that have been done that way. And we have this much the same way as we're seeing in the United States, where there's this political, populist, ahistorical thrust where people don't want to talk about things like the existence of slavery or Jim Crow laws. And they feel that it's sort of like it weakens us as a nation to acknowledge that this happened or whatever it is. You're seeing a similar thing in India where, Gandhi, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, who's been viewed as the father of the nation for a long time and was probably one of the most beloved Indians when I was growing up. There's all sorts of Hindutvas who are actively against him now because they feel that he betrayed the Hindu faith by having this more tolerant view, which I would argue is part of what being a Hindu is. There's a push not to teach about Mughal history at all, because they're seen as invaders who came in rather than Indians who were there, instead of, for instance, teaching more about the Pallava kings or other ruling dynasties that were more Dravidian. There's all sorts of things like this that are happening that I think we can kind of see a close parallel in U.S. politics or politics that we're seeing around the world.
You had, when we were chatting before I hit the record button, you had mentioned gender in Hinduism and the 3 genders versus 2. And I wanted to ask about that because I have done episodes of this show about transgender rights and not just rights, but like just kind of radical transgender acceptance. And I've written about this topic a lot. And, and one of the real regrets I have when I look at kind of our liberty movement is how many people in the liberty movement seem to have decided that liberty is good unless it's the liberty to change your gender, and then it's a problem and your healthcare should be denied, or we shouldn't worry about healthcare being denied, or we shouldn't worry about you being excluded, and so on. And I find it just like profoundly distressing. But one of the arguments that gets made in the kind of anti-trans is not only that there are only 2 genders, but of course there's always only been 2 genders, that everybody knows that it's just natural that there's 2 genders. And this is kind of historically ignorant, right? Like, but I wanted to ask about that in the Hindu context specifically, because it's an interesting kind of contrast to our kind of Western American notion that, of course, this is natural in the way things have always been.
Yeah, this is one of the things, every time I hear that argument, first off, I echo strongly your belief that, this is just a deeply unlibertarian view, right? Like, why are we for individual liberty and self-determination on everything except for some of the most personal things that happen to someone, right? How they view themselves and how they present themselves very much should be, you would think, would be at the core of liberty and should be at the core of liberty. But yeah, I always find it very ahistorical when people suggest that this is this new idea, right? Because trans people have always existed. They've always existed. And that's not a radical belief. There's examples across many different cultures and faiths going back into prehistorical times, pre-written history. Within Hinduism itself, we do have a concept of 3 genders. It's a little complicated, but essentially it boils down to male, female, and everything sort of in between, right? And there's a reason for that, because there is everything sort of in between, even if we're just on the biological level looking at the fact that some people are intersex, right? And so there is an existence of these people. But, Hinduism, again, it's one of the world's oldest religions, and there's evidence of, for example, Shiva being worshipped as far back as 12,000 BC. And Shiva, one of his forms that he comes as is Mohini, where he is a woman. It's Shiva as a woman. So this is a man who transforms into a woman. All right, that is a trans conception. We have another Hindu deity who you don't hear about as much, but Ardhanarishvara, who is half male and half female, right, depicted as. And the reason that we depict it that way is to show that they contain both the male and the female energy, which I mentioned earlier is sort of like one of those background concepts of Hinduism. And it's intertwined and yet separate, right, within this one individual. That, again, is another clearly trans conception. And then, we've had trans people within India for a very long time, and most Indians are actually fairly socially conservative. And so this is something that comes out where it is the way that tolerance is observed or has historically been observed in India is oftentimes like there are separate communities, right? So there are trans people, they've always been around, and oftentimes they're just separate, and they're respected as any separate from the main group. And I'm not saying that that's the best way for it to exist, but it certainly has always been around. This is not a new thing by any measure. For thousands and thousands of years, we've recognized that all people do not, either biologically or otherwise, fall specifically as just male or just female.
I brought this up partly in the context, and I just have to ask about this. We suddenly have a Hindu fairly prominent on the political scene in America, and fascinatingly on the far right of the American political scene. So I'm just curious, as a practicing Hindu, your reaction to Vivek Ramaswamy.
Yeah, Vivek Ramaswamy. Yes. So I have such complicated and convoluted views about this man, right? So when I first heard about him, I saw one of his early campaign ads come out. I saw him. I heard some of the things he was talking about, like the importance of markets and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I like that. And, I can see him. He's clearly an Indian man. You don't see that very often. Increasingly, Indians certainly are getting increasing political power in the United States, as we've seen even with the last election. But, this is interesting. And then one of the things that he said he was running on the basis of in his ad was faith. And then I saw his name and I'm like, okay, well, Vivek Ramaswamy, that's clearly a Hindu name. It's not just a Hindu name. It's a Hindu name from my specific community. What does he mean by faith? Because when I see faith in a campaign ad, particularly when I see faith in a Republican campaign ad, not that I think that it appears in any Democratic ads to my knowledge, they mean a certain specific type of Christian nationalism, right? So that's my cue to step out. I believe very strongly in religious liberty, but many of the people who also claim to believe in religious liberty don't. They just want their specific narrow view of Christian Protestantism, evangelicalism most often, to be a ruling power. It's the opposite of religious liberty, right? So I was curious. I Googled it. I was like, what faith is Vivek Ramaswamy? And I found that was a very popular Google search. And so it at the time I couldn't find anything, but I was curious. I started following the guy, and it has come up a few times on the campaign trail for him. And he's talked about being Hindu, and he's talked about his Hindu beliefs and about how he's offering an alternative to Christian nationalism, while still having the strong faith belief that he thinks is at the core of the American identity, and I think probably is, at least to some degree. So it's very interesting how that kind of plays out there. I will say there are parts of me that make me kind of want to support this guy in the primary, simply to send a message to Republicans that, hey, you know what? If you weren't all Christian nationalists, if you weren't, honestly, a lot of them quite racist, if you weren't anti-immigrant, then you would be able to support people then you would get so much more support. A lot of Indians actually do hold free market and fairly socially conservative beliefs, even if they may not. It's complicated. It doesn't quite map the same way as your traditional American mapping, right? And so that's actually a lot of support for Republicans. Now, that said, Vivek Ramaswamy doesn't seem to hold typical Hindu beliefs either. One of them, obviously, he's made some very inflammatory comments on immigration, although I think some of it he's sort of edgelording when he's talking about things like, okay, yes, he doesn't support birthright citizenship. He believes that everyone should take a citizenship test to be able to vote. I wonder to what extent he's sort of playing on this concept that the conservatives who oppose birthright citizenship do want birthright citizenship for their kids, right? Even if they may not be that educated in how in American civics. And certainly if you look just at standardized testing, the children of Indian immigrants oftentimes are getting much higher scores on those types of things, and under his system would be more likely to be able to vote than the children of some of these Christian nationalists. So that's interesting. I kind of wonder if how much of that is an edgelord statement on his part. But even on things like gender, he sent out an email that says things like, I believe, one of these things, and says, I believe there are only two genders. I'm like, well, you're also going out there and saying that you're a proud Hindu and that shapes all of your beliefs. How do you go out and say, I'm a proud Hindu who only believes in two genders when Hinduism itself recognizes three genders? So certainly a lot of interesting political play there. But yeah, I do appreciate the fact that Hinduism is getting a bit of a national stage, not because I think that religion should determine politics. I don't. But because I think that for too long, when people talk about religion on the political stage, they specifically mean Christianity, and occasionally they mean this sort of warped Judeo-Christianity, as they call it. But that also oftentimes feels like just Christianity with like maybe they can do some stuff quietly in the corner. So I definitely do appreciate that that's happening. And so, as a wider point here, as a libertarian and a staunch individualist, I don't like voting on identity, right? I think that individualism matters and not our skin color or background, things like that. I think that those shape who we are as people, but what fundamentally matters is who we are as people. But on the other hand, there is something nice about in the last election, Kamala Harris ran a campaign ad where for the first time in my life, I heard my mother tongue, Tamil, spoken in this campaign ad, right? And like, I was like, oh, they're pandering, but this is also the first time in my life I've been pandered to, right? So like, there is sort of a subtle appreciation of that where I almost like I don't want the pandering to happen, but if it is going to happen, I like that they are at least attempting to pander to a wider array of different types of people. And it didn't make me vote for Kamala Harris, and it probably won't make me vote for Vivek Ramaswamy, but I still appreciate it. And I still like the fact that that appreciation that we exist and that we matter and that politicians might want to consider how we would vote is at least in the back of their minds.
One of the reasons I've been doing these episodes on the intersection of radical liberalism and different religious faiths is because a lot of people in our circles tend to be, on the one hand, I think atheism is probably overrepresented in libertarian circles compared to other political ideologies and the population at large. But there's also a deep hostility to religious beliefs and to the value of religious beliefs that I think is often unfortunate and can be motivated by either just opposition to authority, and then carrying that forward to religious beliefs as kind of a form of like subservience to an authority, or just the negative experience of what political religiosity looks like in the United States, and which is it doesn't look good,
or anywhere.
Right. And so part of this is that religions, I think, aren't just a set of metaphysical claims that one can say, I don't believe that the God you say exists, or I don't believe that the creation story you have of the universe is the true one, but they are a rich philosophical tradition as well, a rich set of ideas and ethics and ways of perspectives on the world and so on that develops over a long time and has a tremendous amount of value independent of whether one accepts the underlying metaphysical claims. And so with that in mind, we've talked a fair amount about the way that you can construct libertarianism or radical liberalism, radical freedom within a Hindu context, right? But if you are now talking to non-Hindu listeners, people that they're not Hindus, they're not going to turn around and convert to it right now.
Not trying to convert anyone.
But like what is it? What do you see in that tradition of Hindu thought and ideas that is of value to them, that you think could inform the way that they approach liberty, the arguments that are made that just, if they take kind of the philosophical value out of this, what are we missing by not knowing more about the Hindu tradition?
That's a really good question. So this conversation between the two of us arose because I read something that you'd written about the proselytizing atheist, which has been sort of a thorn in my boot for a long time. Um, I find that kind of personality very irritating, right? It's not atheism. That's not the thing that bothers me. It's the sort of like self-aggrandizing view of um I'm just so much smarter than all of you theists out there because I don't believe in this dumb idea that oftentimes is like fundamentally uninformed. A lot of times, these sort of proselytizing atheists are pushing these beliefs of things like, yeah, well, I don't believe that the world was formed in 7 days. And okay, well, neither do most Hindus. And, I believe in science. And, well, there's an awful lot of practicing religious folks who are in science, and certainly lots of Hindus, because our beliefs do not push back against this, right? And so you had done a thought experiment with, what makes someone consider, oh, okay, are you an atheist or not? Or are you just making an exception for one belief because that is the belief that you agree with? So then why wouldn't you apply that to everything? And so I'm not saying this is your argument, but this was the argument as you laid it out in the piece that you wrote. And it came down to, is Zeus real? Right. And so like the idea here is that if you're arguing against a Christian, for example, they would say, no, Zeus is not real. Zeus is mythology. And that's sort of like this gotcha card for, okay, then why is your God real? But if I'm looking at it as a Hindu, I would say it's not the simple answer of, is Zeus real? Well, no, it's more that, there are many different ways of conceptualizing what is generally referred to as God or a higher power. And while for me, that's not Zeus, there's no reason why that should be the case for everyone. And there's not even any reason why that should necessarily be synonymous with this idea of like an archetypal sky daddy or whatever these proselytizing atheists like to use, right? It's, is something nature or is it God? Does it really matter if it's this power that we do not have control of and do not have full understanding of that is happening? Why does that distinction matter, right? And I think that Hindus don't struggle with holding beliefs about science and about faith and holding them very closely and intertwined, because we don't have these very like black and white views of what these things are. And so I think that there is definitely value in that approach. I think that there's also a lot of value in understanding that people see the world in different ways. I appreciated what you wrote about as well, because there are ways in which our faith backgrounds, and I say backgrounds because not everyone might still consider themselves practicing adherents of that faith. And yet it does shape our worldview. It shapes the way in which we perceive the world around us, the way in which we relate to the world around us. And it shapes in many ways not just our internal ethics, but also the way in which we carry out those ethics, the way in which we make very small decisions. I think about this in ways like, okay, well, when I walk into my house, usually the first thing I do is I take off my shoes and I wash my hands and I wash my face. And like, those are just like daily habits, right? And yet they are in a certain way also, they're shaped by these sort of like religious background, but I'm not doing it for a religious reason. I'm not even doing it for a particularly logic-based reason. It's just that's what I do when I walk in the door to my house. So I think that there are a lot of those things that if we're just completely ignoring them or writing them off and writing off writing off not only the people, we misunderstanding things on that level, but I think we also miss how much of that we all hold ourselves, right? And how much our understandings of the way in which our beliefs about the world work and our actions in the world and the way that we interact with other people and the way that we interpret their actions towards us. This is a really funny example, but during the 2016 election, one of the merch items that the Rand Paul campaign released were floorboards, or I don't know what they're called, but like the rubber liners that you put on your car to keep your car clean with Rand's face on them. And for me, I was shocked because I assumed someone else had released them, not the Rand campaign, because I was like, oh, you're putting your feet on him, so you're insulting him? Is this an anti-Rand thing? I'm like, no, it's just, this is that default cultural lens, which again comes from this religious lens that I'm just interpreting the world through, and I just didn't even think about it, right? And from the same perspective, it's clear to me that whoever made those floorboards, floor liners, I don't know what you call them, they weren't a Hindu. I know that for certain. Yeah, so I think that just understanding where people are coming from is probably the biggest value. And I could say other things like tolerance and the sort of individualism, the idea of each of us having our own path, ahimsa, like you mentioned, nonviolence, or at least attempts towards nonviolence. I think all of those are very valuable. And obviously, there's a religion that I myself embrace. And so I think many aspects are valuable, but at least at the meta level, just that's, it makes us better people. And I think also better advocates for the ideas that we do have and that we do want to put forward.
Thank you for listening to Reimagining Liberty. If you like the show and want to support it, head to reimaginingliberty.com to learn more. You'll get early access to all my essays, as well as be able to join the Reimagining Liberty Discord community and book club. That's reimaginingliberty.com, or look for the link in the show notes. Talk to you soon.